When I first submitted my abstract, my topic was quite broad. So it's textual reuse, intertextuality, intratextuality. In an early Mahāyāna Prajñāpāramitā exegetical tradition. But when I prepare my presentation, I realized this is too broad, and so I need to narrow down my focus. So I added here a subtitle, a study on anonymous quotation in the Tuan, in Japanese, Tachitoron, I don't know how it's in Korean, but in Sanskrit it's the Mahāprajñāpāramitā Upadesha. Under my paper is listed under the manuscript study section. My paper has little to do with manuscript, except for this photo. This is a 4th or 5th century Kucha manuscript of the Tuan. The main textual source of my studies, my paper, which I will introduce to you shortly. The reuse of earlier texts through quotation, paraphrase, or adaptation is a common feature of Buddhist commentary literature. In recent years, this phenomenon has received growing scholarly attention, both in Indian philosophy and Buddhist studies. So here are some notable contributions. In my paper, I focus on one specific form of textual reuse, which is I call anonymous quotations. So those quotations introduced by the expression like some say or other says. So you would find this kind of quotation very often in the commentarial text. And even in the earliest Gandhari commentaries preserved in the 1st century birchbark manuscripts, they also systematically present alternative views attributed to unnamed sources. Similar patterns are found in the commentaries in Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan literature. In Pali commentaries, anonymous voices, often introduced by Geji, Anye, Apare, are treated as authoritative alongside with the Tipitaka and lost commentarial works. So as Honor noted, these views commanded a degree of interest and respect. So yet, despite their significance, anonymous quotation remain understudied, especially in the Mahāyāna context. And this presentation draws from my diffuse research on the Tuan, a monumental commentary on the larger Prajñāpāramitā, traditionally attributed to Nagarjuna, and it is one of the most authoritative texts in East Asian Buddhism, and sometimes we would regard it as an encyclopedia of Mahāyāna Buddhism. And the Tuan holds a unique place in Mahāyāna literature. It is not only one of the earliest extant Indian commentary on the Prajñāpāramitā, but also one of the earliest surviving Mahāyāna Sutra commentaries more broadly. So this is a very important point for my paper because it shapes how we understand early Mahāyāna exegetical tradition. And the Sanskrit original has been lost, and the text only survives in the Chinese translation completed by Kumarajiva in the beginning of the 5th century. And intertextuality in the Tuan has been widely studied, especially by Etienne Lamotte, who meticulously traced the reused materials in his annotated translation. But however, most research has focused on identifiable sources or sources with titles. And my study narrows in only on the anonymous quotations, which are surprisingly many in this text. So the Tuan contains around 450 anonymous quotations, typically marked by the phrases like Yoren Yen or some say, and similar expressions you can see here. Just for comparison, so Mori estimates that the total number of anonymous quotations introduced by some say or others say in the Pali Atthakatha amount to approximately 600. But this text alone contains 450, so that's a lot. Despite their frequency, these quotations remain largely overlooked. And a key part of my research involves tracing the potential sources and parallels of these anonymous quotations, primarily using them based on the Chinese Buddhist canon. And so far, I have identified potential parallels for about 60% of anonymous quotation in the Tao Te Ching Luân. And many of these links are suggestive, showing shared terminology or ideas, while others are more conclusive, revealing a very clear textual relationships. And so as shown in the chart, many quotations are traced back to Abhidhamma sources, especially the Sarvastivadin text, and some others link to non-Mahāyāna, some to Mahāyāna, or even to other parts of the Tao Te Ching itself. So in the following slides, I will present selected examples of these more definitive parallels, grouped by intratextuality, or the reuse within the Tao Te Ching, and the intertextuality, or reuse with the external text. Okay, so let's begin with the first type I call internal textual reuse, or intratextuality. I have identified around 68 cases where anonymous quotations closely parallel other parts of the Tao Te Ching. So you have the anonymous quotation in the Tao Te Ching, but that opinion is kind of related to other explanation in the same text, right? So here's a kind of like a clear example. So here on the left, we have an anonymous quotation in Fascicle 51, glossing the term asankhyeya, or innumerable. And this passage closely mirrors a section or another explanation in the same Tao Te Ching, but in a different place in Fascicle 15. So we see the same structure, same idea, but slightly different phrasings. So here it is introduced as an anonymous quotation, some say, but over there it is just introduced as moreover, just like an opinion of the commentator there. So this suggests that maybe this quotation is quoting from the other part, right? And actually, the quoting oneself is not unusual in Indic Buddhist commentaries. For example, like Kramer notes that Thiramati frequently cites his own views in the Trimsika Vijñapti Bhashya. And what's more intriguing is when authors quote themselves anonymously using phrases like some say. And Nakamura and Mark observed that Haribhatra, in his Abhisamayalankara Aloka, introduces his own ideas with the markers like iti kechit, iti yeke, iti anaye. So he quotes himself and he introduced some say. He did not say I say, right? So this supports the idea that the Tao Te Ching may also contain self-quotations disguised as anonymous quotations. And sometimes we also find more complex pattern. And here is one example. So also on the glossing the term asankhyeya, we have here one opinion in Fascicle 51 is introduced as some people say, but we find it is related to another passage in the Tao Te Ching. And in turn, that passage is kind of like also parallel another passage from the Bai Luân. So in this case, we don't know whether the opinion from Fascicle 51 is citing opinion from Fascicle 1, or both of them citing the Bai Luân. Right? So this example shows the dynamic process of textual formulation in the Dhartu Tulun, where anonymous quotations are not merely reused, but adaptively reconstructed. And okay, so now let's move to the second type of textual reuse. I call the external textual reuse or intertextuality. So due to time constraints, I'll just focus on the intertextuality between the Dhartu Tulun and the Sarvastivada in Abhidharma sources. So while the Dhartu Tulun is often seen as opposing the Sarvastivada or Vaibhasika views, its relationship with the Sarvastivada in exegesis is more complex and more nuanced. This is especially evident in Fascicle 4, which contains an extensive borrowing from the Mahavibhasa. So I find one case like 5 title pages of the Dhartu Tulun closely parallels to the Mahavibhasa. It's like copy and paste, right? And in this portion, it contains multiple questions and answers. And here I only show you one example, one question on the measure of merit, and it contains multiple explanations. So here we can see even the question also similar, and the first answer are very closely related. Similarly, we have the opinion 2 and 3 in the Dhartu Tulun correspond to opinion 2 and 3 in the Mahavibhasa, and but the opinion number 4 in the Mahavibhasa has no correspondence in the Dhartu Tulun. And similarly, number 5 in the Mahavibhasa has no correspondence. But opinion number 4 in the Dhartu Tulun correspond to the opinion 7. And here we have, similarly, we have the, yeah. So that's a long section, long answer. So what does this example tell us, right? So for me, I think this has 2 key implications of this example. So first, it highlights the Dhartu Tulun's method of tacit or silent borrowing. So borrowing silently. We borrow what you don't acknowledge, the source. And the Mahavibhasa is the passage is silently incorporated without attribution. And secondly, it shows that anonymous views were not always transmitted individually. Instead, they were often compiled into larger collections. So like the Vibhasa Compendia, grouped by theme and topic, and these compilations then borrowed and repurposed by different traditions. Okay. So in this example, I show that we see that anonymous quotation also relate to other alternatives views introduced by the expression moreover. So as I mentioned earlier, so when a view is introduced as some say, it implies that we are quoting from external source. But when an opinion just in the text, you see moreover, alternatively, is implied that maybe this opinion is from the commentator themselves, right? But this example shows that the second case is not the case. Sometimes they also introduce the opinion which might be from external source, but they do not introduce as some say, but introduce as moreover. And this complexity deepens when opinions marked as anonymous in other sources appear unmarked in the Dhartu Tulun. So here we have the same opinions, the same question, and in the Mahavibhasa is introduced as some say. But in the Dhartu Tulun, we don't see that kind of marker. So it looks like these opinions belong to the Dhartu Tulun compilers. But in fact, This borrow also again, borrow from the Mahavibhasha. So this suggests that the anonymous markers may have been dropped during the compilation or transmission. So this raises broader question about how the Datulun absorbed external views, sometimes silently, and how many anonymous quotations may remain unrecognized due to the lack of formal attribution. So as I mentioned, the quotation introduced by some say like around 450, but this is the case. We might have many more opinions like this. Okay, so by today's standard, academic standard, the kind of unacknowledged reuse we've seen might be labeled as plagiarism. But this concept doesn't apply to the intellectual culture of ancient and medieval India. In those traditions, commentators often reused earlier clauses without citation. As Freschi and others have noted, texts were seen as part of a continuous tradition, not as standalone original works. So silent borrowing was not deception. It was a sign of respect and continuity. And our Buddhist commentators operated within this environment, and their reuse of earlier materials, sometimes anonymously and sometimes silently, was a legitimate and accepted part of the commentarial process. Okay, and also what these examples tell us about the relationship between Sarvastivadin and Mahāyāna. And this example reveals a more nuanced relationship between them rather than just simple opposition. So while the Datulun often critiques Sarvastivadin doctrines, it doesn't reject the tradition wholesale. Instead, it actively incorporates and builds on Sarvastivadin texts and ideas. And this dual dynamic between criticism and appropriation reflects a complex intellectual engagement. So it also deepens Professor Stefano Zachetti's observation that the Datulun may have adopted the Vibhasa compendia, the exegetical model. But here, my examples also show that the Datulun not only follows the exegetical model, but it directly integrates the Vibhasa compendia content, but passages into its own compilation. Okay, so now I've moved to the final example. So this example highlights the pan-Buddhist nature of anonymous quotations. This example also revisits the same topic we have seen earlier, the measure of one merit. So several quotations found in the Mahavibhasa and the Datulun also appear widely across a wide range of scholastic texts, including the Sarvastivadin Abhidhamma and also the Yogacara Sautrantika tradition, like including the Abhidhamma Kosha Bhashya. So I just go through the example quickly. So you will see similar opinion in across different texts, belong to different tradition. Okay. And some might be longer, some shorter, have more opinions. Okay. So in summary of all the example I've shown you so far, so we have two key observations from this table. So first, so while some opinions share across all texts, so like this on the number of 74414, the same opinion you can find all the texts, but some others only appear in the Mahavibhasa or the Datulun. Right. So this suggests that these two texts act as kind of the banks or reservoir of anonymous quotations, resources that later commentators could draw upon. And second, the sequence of these opinions varies across tradition. So the same opinion, but the sequence in the text are different. So these variations point to a flexible exegetical culture where shared content could be reorganized and reframed to suit different interpretive needs. Okay, so by way of conclusion, these anonymous quotations likely function as shared exegetical building blocks, properly treated as pan-Buddhist knowledge, freely reusable and adaptable by commentators across traditions to suit their purposes. And they contribute to the blurring of sectarian boundaries between Buddhist scholastic traditions. And they facilitate textual adaptation and transmission across Buddhist traditions, especially between mainstream Sarvastivada and early Mahāyāna, as well as within the Prajñāpāramitā commentary traditions. So in this sense, these anonymous quotations serve as the bridges connecting different traditions. And Thartu Tulan's borrowing and reformulating and repackaging of earlier exegetical materials, particularly from the Abhidhamma tradition via anonymous quotations, offer a rare insight into the earlier and maybe lost Prajñāpāramitā exegetical traditions. And it also reflects a broader patterns of textual compilation in the Buddhist scholastic world of the early centuries of the Common Era. So thank you very much for your kind attention.